All right, let's try to hop around a little bit more before we continue this story. Before it gets too dark. I mean, it's already after sundown, so it's gonna get dark soon. So let's hop around, like as we say in Yiddish. This subject of what's this self-proclaimed anti-racism that I'm saying is actually racist. It believes in segregation. It believes that the races cannot be reconciled. Basically, that the what they call the critical race theory, that's essentially a racist ideology, because again, they're if you're asking someone to notice color and not be colorblind, well, what does that mean about mixed race couples? Is that problematic in the view of the ones who believe in the critical race theory and in and in this anti-racism that insists that you notice race, you notice color? And if so, and again, maybe I'm putting words into their mouth, but I would assume so, because if they're telling you to notice race, they're telling you to notice color, and that means something, and that it's important to the self-proclaimed anti-racist that's actually racist. And again, I use this term racism because I think racism is a neutral term. Racism is the idea of believing that race means something, whether positive or negative. This idea that racism only means racial discrimination is false in my estimation. Again, maybe I'm wrong. Really, I don't think there is an essential right or wrong here. I think these are different philosophies, and I respect the right of those who have these other philosophies, as long as they're not imposing them in a means to undermine our Constitution, because our Constitution is a colorblind Constitution, at least as it exists today, and even as it existed in its inception, it was always colorblind, because slavery in the Constitution is not a racial issue. Let's repeat that. Slavery in the Constitution is not a racial issue. That doesn't mean that there wasn't racism involved in slavery. Of course there was. But the Constitution is a colorblind document. And so a free black man was counted as 5/5, if you want to say, as 100% human. And also this idea of 3/5 compromise was not racist in the idea of saying that a slave is only 3/5 human, but rather recognizing that if slaves are not allowed to vote, they shouldn't be counted in the census, giving more power to their masters and oppressors. Because the anti-slavery position of those who wish to abolish slavery in the Constitution and saw that as the goal of the Constitution was to say that slaves should not be counted at all in the census if they're not being allowed to vote, and that and those who were pro-slavery wanted to keep them from voting, but still count them so that their population would mean something vis-a-vis continuing to oppress them. And so all these idiots who say that the framers thought that a slave, and they extend that to mean a black person because the majority of the slaves were black, that somehow a slave was 3/5 of a human being, that they're totally ignoring the history and the meaning of the 3/5 compromise. And they're just demonstrating their ignorance if they really believe that, which I don't know if they're that ignorant or if they're just grasping at straws just to make a point that isn't even true. and by, I can't use the word whitewashing, but by painting over history, such as the removal of Dr. Seuss's books that perhaps should be published with commentary, refuting and these things as a historical relic rather than banning these books. You know, I mean, there's a history lesson that you learn by watching, you know, a cartoon with Superman or Daffy Duck that presents Japanese in a negative way. And yes, that was wrong for them to do that. But we were in the middle of a war. And I think what should be more emphasized and celebrated and taught is the contrast between, if you would go 5 years after World War II, how the Japanese were embraced by American culture and no longer seen as the enemy, and how people were fascinated with the Japanese culture after being taught that these were your enemies and all types of disgusting epithets against them. And when you compare and contrast those things, that shows something very great about America. That yes, we were at war. And certain things happen when you're at war. And how quickly things turn around. That's amazing. That's inspiring. And it's not color blindness to say, oh, you got to stop being Japanese. But there are cultural exchanges that happen. Cultural exchange is not a one-way street. You know, that's also the fallacy of this anti-racist movement of saying that that the people who are being oppressed or were oppressed are being forced to accept the culture of their oppressors. Well, that's like saying that cultural exchange is a one-way street. But again, what do the left say? Oh, you cannot engage in cultural appropriation because that's offensive to these other cultures. But is it really? If they have something good, yes, we shouldn't be mocking other cultures. We shouldn't be making fun of other cultures. But if there's something good that we enjoy from another culture, what's wrong with incorporating that into ours and vice versa? But then again, there are many levels of culture as well, and that's the main point that I want to bring out, is that the America is not any one culture. It's many cultures with many religions and many races and many ethnicities and many ancestral nationalities. But there is a common thread that all Americans should embrace, even though the fact of the matter is you're not required to embrace that. But there is an idea of a domestic enemy of the Constitution, right? We're called, our political servants who we elect, who we hire to represent us, are made to swear to protect and defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. So yes, there is an idea of something being un-American, of someone being a domestic enemy of the Constitution. But there's two different sides. It seems like every side sees the other side as an enemy, as a domestic enemy of the Constitution. And I think when you're going to make that argument that one side or the other is a domestic enemy of the Constitution, well then let's look at the Constitution as it is written. What do the words say? Not just interpretations that have been made, but what do the words actually say? What does it actually mean? Rather than just being like, oh, this is unconstitutional, that's unconstitutional, because the truth of the matter is, the Constitution is a colorblind document. It is. There is a level of color blindness within the basics of what America is about that still allows for a multicultural society. I mean, there's certain things we got to put our foot down about, and they're very few things, to be honest. And some folks think they should be less things. And those folks who I would call liberal tend to be on the American right, tend to be the American conservatives. And the people who call themselves liberal, who are on the left, aren't really liberal. They want to impose more and more things upon this country to say what's right and what's wrong. So, and I don't mind people having that within their own freedom of association and freedom of speech and freedom of expression, as long as they're not imposing it on the society at large. Because again, what's the end game of this anti-racism? It seems to be that the end game of this self-proclaimed anti-racist movement is the same as Jim Crow. And it just goes and proves that the Democrats never changed. They are still the party of racism. This obsession with identity politics is just the old Jim Crow Dixiecrat racism. And the same thing, the history of gun control, the history of the pro-abortion movements are all rooted in racism and continue to express themselves in racist forms. And the outcomes are negative on the minority communities. Meaning, look at Planned Parenthood. I mean, Sean Hannity brought this up. You know, you want to cancel Dr. Seuss for being racist, but you don't want to cancel Planned Parenthood for its racist history. And so the guy, this professor, he said, well, they're not racist anymore. But they are, because there's a genocide against black babies going on in America that per capita, the biggest victims of abortion are black babies. There's lynching, legalized lynching going on in the womb. And that's really what the whole movement's about. Even to the point where a few years ago someone called up Planned Parenthood and said, if I want to donate to your organization and earmark the money specifically to go to the black community, can I do them? They said, of course, absolutely. Now they think, well, they're helping the poor black mothers, but what they're not realizing is that they're committing genocide against the black race. And so you can't have it both ways. I don't get it. Like, how do you balance these two approaches? Because it's essentially, you know, the so-called anti-racists are the racists. And I think you can notice color, notice race on one hand and still be colorblind on the other hand. Meaning, on the level of the government and so forth, we're colorblind. On the level of the cultures, well, there's not one black culture. There's not one African American culture. All of these cultures, just like there's not one white culture, all of these cultures are diverse, and there's tremendous diversity, not only political diversity, but religious diversity, ethnic diversity, cultural diversity in all of these cultures. You know, there's a particular culture of urban blacks that's different than the culture of suburban blacks. There's a particular culture of different cities and different neighborhoods and different religious groups, different churches, different mosques, black synagogues, black Jewish groups. All of these different groups have this diversity that is worthy of study, is worthy of being celebrated, is worthy of academic study. It's there, and the same thing with not only the black cultures, but the different white cultures, the different Asian cultures, the different Hispanic cultures. These different aspects of diversity are not supposed to be ignored. And so I will agree with the claim of the anti-racist, self-proclaimed anti-racist, that there is value in recognizing color and recognizing race and recognizing these cultures and celebrating them. But one can still be essentially colorblind. You can combine both things, and you can also help those that have been oppressed in an equitable way without going to the soft bigotry of low expectations. Meaning, let's look at what President Trump did. He made these opportunity zones in economically blighted inner cities that are predominantly of minority groups, particularly African American and Hispanic. And he helped those communities get a leg up because he recognized, yes, they did need help. He was working for the actual equity that the left gives lip service to. He was actually doing it. The same thing. He was helping the historically black colleges and universities because he recognized that there was injustice that needed to be fixed. Now the left wants to ban funding to these colleges and universities, the historically black colleges and universities, because the left are racist. This equality law, again, it's not about equality, but it's about equity, and there's a time and a place for equity. But it's essentially racist and discriminatory, and also it's a tool to undermine religious freedom. You know, we can protect people from discrimination without punishing the descendants of discriminators. And we can also, and without discriminating against other groups. You don't have to discriminate against one group to gain equity for the other group. And you certainly cannot discriminate against religious rights, and you cannot remove religious freedoms in America. And in America, you can have religious views that are despicable as long as you're not abusing somebody else. Meaning, yes, you could have a church that opposes, let's say, interracial marriage. And people can decide whether or not they want to belong to that church. And if a large group of people on their own are disgusted by that belief and they leave that church, well, maybe the church will change their mind. And maybe they won't. And maybe they'll disappear. And that is how the free market of religious values in America works. in our religion, we don't have a belief that you can't have interracial marriage, but we just say if you're not born of this faith and you want to marry someone in this faith, Orthodox Judaism or conservative Judaism for that matter, you have to convert. And well, maybe the Orthodox and the conservative are going to have different standards for conversion, but they're never going to say you can't have the interracial marriage. On the other hand, some of the Black Hebrew Israelite groups might say no, you have to marry, you can only marry another black person, or you cannot marry a white person. Although it's interesting, I encountered someone in the prison where I worked. He's since been released. Who he was white and he was listed as a Black Hebrew Israelite, and I asked him about that, and he said, well, it's because his stepfather is of this faith, and his mother and him, they accepted this faith. And so I guess there are aspects of those communities that are not racist, but they have the right to be racist if they want to be. And the only thing is that they don't have the right to impose that on America. But if they want to say, the Nation of Islam or whatever, although the truth is, the Nation of Islam, as far as I know, does not teach that you're not allowed to have interracial marriage. I know that that Minister Farrakhan often talks about how he is there for the oppressed, impoverished white person, just like he is for the black person. So at least he gives some lip service that he's not against just white people or against Jews. And again, he makes these claims, but then, it is what it is. And you're going to say, well, he's racist. I don't know. I'm willing to listen to both sides. I'm just not willing to see our Constitution attacked, which includes protecting their freedom, protecting the freedom of the Nation of Islam, protecting the freedom of the Black Hebrew Israelites, protecting the freedom of whatever other church or mosque or religious group or non-religious group, as long as they are not imposing their group's beliefs on the nation as a whole, or or using it to actually hurt other people, steal from people, murder people, commit acts of violence against people, and so forth. Of course, they have no right to do that. And that's the story. It's already dark now, although it's still light behind me. That's interesting, but it's not light in front of me, and so that's why it's hard to see. But that's the message that I have here, is that we can accept some of the, and certainly allow these beliefs of the anti-racist, which I believe to be racist, and I oppose their beliefs personally, but I think you can say that there is room for their beliefs in the greater discussion, but there has to be room for both sides. There has to be room for the so-called anti-racist argument that I believe to be racist, just like there has to be room for, now there is no room for racial discrimination. I don't think we should be teaching any forms of racial discrimination. I don't think that the KKK has to be given a platform or a voice in the schools or something. And kind of for the same reason, I don't think these so-called anti-racists who are really racist really deserve to have a voice in the schools. But I think it's worthwhile to study these different views and let people come to their own conclusions, because to me, I think the colorblind view is the one that's going to win out in the end. And also, you got to also know the history, because this whole idea of whiteness. Well, Christianity is not whiteness. You know, the Odinists say, oh look, the Christians impose the Jewish desert god on we woodland Norse people. You know, which I believe, you know, the God of the Bible to be the creator God of the universe, and in a totally different category than their Norse gods and so forth, that you can't even compare. That even, you know, only using the same word because the Bible uses the same word Elohim to refer both to the creator who fills all worlds and surrounds all worlds, and to the gods of others, as well as the judges. Human judges are also called Elohim in the Bible. So that's the only reason why I can feel justified to use that word gods. But we just make a distinction between the big G and the little g's, right? At least in English. In Hebrew, you don't have a big aleph and a little aleph used in that form, although it's used for other reasons, but not there. And the truth of the matter is, the Ethiopian, African black people were Christians long before the Norse people were, right? So you can't say Christianity is a white ideology or even an American ideology. It just so happened that, yeah, maybe a lot of folks who were enslaved were not Christian, and they became Christian when they came to America. But is that an essential oppression? I don't believe so, because like we said, most of and the thing is it really any different for an African to accept Islam than to accept Christianity? They're both Middle Eastern religions. Neither is a particularly black religion, but a lot of black people have converted to those religions over the millennia, and today a lot of black people are either Christian or Muslim, including in Africa. You know, not very, you know, yes, you still have some of the old animists and pagan cultures and so forth, and some, you know, that are syncretic, that involve both, and it's worthwhile to study all of these. There's nothing, you know, essentially, you know, black or white or American for that matter. Yes, America was founded mostly by Christians, but there were black founders, there were white founders. All right, the majority were white, but there were black founders who were very basic and integral to the founding of the United States as it exists today. The black founders were just as important as the white founders, just as the Jewish and agnostic founders were integral to the founding of the United States as the Christian founders were. And there's place to embrace and celebrate and study all of these men and women, and not merely say, you know, this is a white Christian country, while also not denying the Christian foundations of this country, which are not particularly white, and I don't believe there's any really such thing as a single white race. There are several white cultures and nationalities, each of which deserves to be celebrated and respected just as much as any black or Asian or Hispanic culture. And many of these cultures developed over the years and changed over the years. I mean, look at the Columbian Exchange. Look at the effect that the Columbian Exchange had on the world. Look at the potato and tobacco, two new world items that totally took Europe and Asia, to a lesser extent, by storm, to the point where in our Jewish cultures you have traditional foods made out of potatoes, whereas you didn't have potatoes 600 years ago in Jewish communities, and to the point where the Irish communities were almost decimated because of the potato famine. That is worthy of study, of seeing how, yes, cultures change, cultures have exchange, and so too the black and white cultures have exchange. Look at how much, white kids in America and how white adults in America, enjoy African American styles of music, or African American entertainers and so forth were embraced and totally normal, meaning we didn't see any problem watching the Cosby Show or the Fresh Prince, etc. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment. I got a call coming in. We'll talk later.